Hello, welcome to another story time. This book is pretty exciting, and so I'm glad you've chosen it. Let's get right to it. It's been a while since I have read this book, so I hope my notes here can help me through explaining it for you. Um, let's see. There we go. So it's called "Their Eyes Were Watching God" by Zora Neale Hurston, and just the story of the book and of her writings, I think, is interesting. You can see the book was published in 1937. Here she is. Here's Zora. Um, you can see when she was born and died. Her books weren't as popular when she was alive as when she was dead. She lived in a small little town of Edenville, Florida, which is a real place, which is where this book takes place as well. It's just north of Orlando. It's a very small town. I think there's like 2,500 people that live there today. So a small little town. But like I said, her books weren't as popular when she was alive as after her death, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Um, in fact, like later in her life, she had to find jobs just to support herself. Like she was a substitute teacher for a little bit. She worked as a maid. She was on public assistance. So certainly the work wasn't appreciated, and she did not benefit from it as much as maybe she probably should have. And maybe there's a reason for that. Being an African American woman publishing in the 1930s probably isn't the most, they're not going to get the most success. It wasn't until the 1970s where another African American female writer, Alice Walker, kind of works to give some attention to Zora. First thing she does is finds the unmarked grave that she was buried in, and puts up a monument for her, and then works to get her writings more public and more attention. So I thought that was kind of cool. So this is a pretty exciting book, and so I hope I can convey the excitement to you. Some things that I want you to think about, though, while you're listening to the story, is think about, first of all, the roles of gender. Obviously, that's going to play a major role, and maybe not intentionally, but certainly just because of the perspective of the writer and the perspective of the narrator and the perspective of the people who are talking to each other. Gender is going to play an impact, and so it'd be great to see if you could pick that apart and analyze that. The concepts of friendship and love are very important as well. If you're interested in those things, of what these things mean, what they mean to you, and how are they reflected in the characters of this novel and of the time of the novel. Judgment and forgiveness are important, as you'll see. Who has the power to judge? When should we judge? And if somebody messes up, when do you give forgiveness? And then certainly this concept of independence. When should you, how should you be on your own, live for yourself, things like that. And again, in 1937, this is long before the civil rights movement. It's really in that period between Reconstruction in the country when it comes to race, where there was no slavery, but certainly the residue of slavery is still pretty thick, especially in the South. And so when are you allowed to go do your own thing? Okay, let's get to the story. First of all, the novel opens like this. And I love this quote. When we talk about gender, it this kind of starts us off thinking about those things right away. And this is just a beautiful couple sentences that Zora writes about how you see the world and how you see your role in the world or your place in the world. And it goes like this: ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. I love that. I just love that. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all of those things they don't want to remember and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. So I think at the beginning when I first read this, I remember thinking that she was talking about all human beings, you know. Maybe she is still in that first couple sentences. And then the second thing was she distinguishes this from women from men. And maybe there's a reason why she has to do this, why she has to separate how women interpret their lives and the memories in their lives differently from men. And it kind of gets to those issues of independence as well. You know, if race isn't a big enough oppressor on the lives of African Americans, try being an African American woman who then has to work through the social constructs of in any kind of relationship between men and women, who has the power to control that. Is it the man or the woman? And certainly the characters in this book struggle with that. The book is structured very interestingly. So there are 20 chapters. So between chapter 1 and chapter 20, really only a span of a couple hours passes in real life. But it's the telling of the story of the many years that happen in between that the book is focused on. So the book opens and ends at the same place, basically. But Zora takes us through an intense narrative of some people's lives, some very exciting lives. And so some of the characters that you have to know, Phoebe Watson and Janie Starks are really the most important people. Janie is the main character. And Phoebe is her friend. So one day, Phoebe and Sam Watson sitting on their porch of Eatonville, Florida, and they see this woman marching down the street. It's Janie Starks. She is dressed in overalls, and it's funny how the people on the porch like interpret Janie differently. The men are still somewhat taken by her good looks, and the women are like all like, who does she think she is, and all that, coming back like this, because they remember her leaving the town of Eatonville, dressed in a blue satin dress and having everything she wants, and now she's returning in these dirty overalls. So they all jump to immediate conclusions, judgments in their own minds about what has happened to this poor girl. This woman, she's not a girl anymore. She's old. Janie makes her way back to her old house, and Phoebe was her friend when they used to live there, and so Phoebe goes over to talk about things, and Phoebe's like, "Oh, did Tea Cake treat you poorly and dump you and all of those things?" So Tea Cake was a man that Janie was married to, who was like I think 10 years younger than her. And really, there's been this jealousy of Janie because she was married to a younger man and all of that, and having an exciting life and all that, which we'll get to. Janie says, no, Tea Cake is dead, and everything's good, and no one took my money and all of that kind of stuff. And so Phoebe like immediately drops her judgment of what she imagines Janie to have gone through and who Janie is, and instead decides to help and brings over some rice and some food for Janie, and they sit down and Janie begins to tell the story of what has happened. And this brings us to chapter 2. um, Janie tells this story and goes all the way back to when she lived with her grandmother, who she called Nanny. Nanny and her first lived in the house of a white woman, Mrs. Washburn, who was kind to them, was rich, and always had money to help them with for various things. Janie always dressed nice, played with Mrs. Washburn's white grandchildren. And it wasn't until, I forget how old she was, but maybe 6 or something like that, when Janie saw a picture of the white grandchildren and her in the backyard or something, that's the first time when Janie realized that she wasn't white. So I think there's something to be said there about how she was treated in the Washburn estate. But when she went to school, because she was so well dressed and well behaved, that's not the right word. She was so well dressed and refined that she was picked on at school because of her apparent success. Mrs. Washburn helped Nanny purchase their own house, and so they had a really nice life here, Nanny and Janie. Janie was out in the yard one day. I think she was reading. No. I think she was reading. I'm not sure. But she's outside, and this man comes along, Johnny Taylor, who steals a kiss, and it was, rather innocent. It wasn't like, "Hey, kiss me." It was, kind of a sweet moment. And Nanny sees this. She just wakes up at the right time and looks out the window and sees this kiss. And this is when Nanny realizes that maybe it's time for her to kind of step aside, to stop controlling and protecting Janie, and let someone else do it. But that someone else is not Johnny Taylor, and that someone else is not anyone Janie really wants. Nanny has picked someone else, and we'll talk about that person in a minute. But this gives a moment here in chapter 2 where Nanny tells Janie her story about how she was born into slavery and how she was impregnated by her master, and that's where her daughter Leafy was born. Nanny had dreams of her own with emancipation and freedom, and realized that she probably wasn't going to be able to realize those dreams, and so she decided to invest everything she had into her daughter Leafy, and that Leafy would be able to experience and realize her dreams. But Leafy up and left. She wasn't having any of that, and I don't remember if they tell you much about the story of Leafy and what happened to her, but she wasn't there, and so she left behind her newborn baby, Janie. Nanny says that she had many opportunities to marry, but she would not do that. She would not do things for her own happiness if they interfered with the happiness of Janie, who now the dreams that Nanny wanted Leafy to experience now kind of transferred to Janie. And so she decided, Nanny did, that the person that Janie should marry is this Logan Killix, who has 60 acres of land, who's a farmer, who's a little older, I think much older than Janie, but is stable and would protect Janie for the rest of her life. And then he realizes that there's nothing else that she can do but say, this is who you should marry. And so there is a wedding. She gets married. Janie and Logan get married. Mrs. Washburn helps pay for the wedding. It's a very nice wedding. And Janie's really not in love with Logan, but thinks that husband and wives learn to love each other. And she has every intention that this is what's going to happen to her. She's going to come to love Logan, but that doesn't happen. And so one day she goes to visit Nanny and explains this is not how, I thought I would be in love with him by now. It's been I don't know, 3 months and there's nothing. And Nanny's you're just so young. You need to kind of just wake up and see how the world really works, and just give it time, blah, blah, blah. And that's not what Janie wanted to hear, but before they could talk more about it, like within a month, Danny is dead. And so Janie's on her own with Logan. And Logan is a hard worker, but he expects more from his wife. Janie stays inside most of the day, doesn't really, does work around the house while he's out in the field. And he's like, we expect more from you. In fact, I expect you out plowing in the fields. You should do what I say. You're my wife. And of course, Janie's having none of that. One day, though, Logan says, you need to peel these potatoes. And so Janie takes them outside, and she's outside in the yard, much like she is when she meets the first man that she kisses. She's out in the yard and peeling potatoes, and this guy Joe Starks comes around, and he is full of personality and charisma, and which we'll talk about in a minute, and starts talking to her, and he leaves. He leaves, and Janie, like, you know what, I think I'd rather be with him. And she tells Logan this. He's like, I met this guy named Joe. I really like him. He's really exciting. And I just might run off with him. And Logan kind of laughs it off. But he's a little worried. And so there's more problems happening in the marriage between Janie and Logan. They're not getting along, and Janie's not doing the work that she's supposed to do. And Janie kind of tells Logan off, like, here's what your problem is. And it really hurts him. And he's on the verge of tears, but he won't cry because he's a man and he's not supposed to cry. But that's it. Janie runs off with Joe, leaves Logan behind. So they starts off exciting, Joe and Janie. They zip to this place, which is eventually going to become the town Evansville, Florida. Oh yeah, Eatonville. There you go, Eatonville, Florida. And so they go to this physical space, which is not the town yet, but it's going to be. But it becomes a town because of Joe, because of his personality, his charisma, his friendliness. Everybody likes Joe. And then there's Janie with her good looks. Everyone likes Janie, and she's nice, and they kind of bring everyone together, and they say, we're going to form a town here called Eatonville. And immediately Joe begins to put together, he's going to build a store for himself. He gets the government to build a post office there. He has 200 acres of his own that he's going to sell off to people so that there's a real town. And of course, because of all his work, he becomes the mayor of Eatonville, the first mayor of Eatonville, Florida. He decides that he wants a electric street light in town, so he pays for it himself. And after it's erected, they have this big party underneath the street light that he pays for, and everybody's just having a great time. Except that there is this clear indication of who's in charge, and it's Joe. Joe does not like her wife. Joe does not like his wife having any power whatsoever, and he puts her in her place all the time. In fact, there's this thing about her hair that he won't let her show her hair because he's afraid that it might attract other men. So he makes her like put her hair up so that other people can't see it. Janie's having these feelings of not fitting in again. I mean, back when she was a young girl and realizing that maybe she wasn't like everyone else, didn't live like everyone else, she's having these same feelings here. But this is when she meets Phoebe Watson, and they become good friends. And Phoebe and her talk about the verbal abuse, the escalating verbal abuse that Joe puts on her. And I mean, it's in public, it's in private. Janie can never seem to do anything right in Joe's eyes. He yells at her in the store when she makes a mistake. And they both Phoebe and Janie talk about maybe this marriage thing isn't working out very well. So much like at the beginning of the book, there are these people called the porch sitters, and I think Zora puts them in the book as kind of like the chorus from those old, you know, mythical stories, people who comment on what's going on so that we, the reader, can kind of get an idea of what people are thinking. So these porch sitters sit on the porch, usually in Phoebe and Sam's house, and they watch things going on and they talk about them and joke about them and all of those things. And Joe forbids Janie from talking at these when these people are just kind of hanging out. So again, this kind of power structure, this gender power structure, is in place in Joe and Janie's marriage. However, there is an experience here where there's a mule in town walking around the street, and they go up, the porch sitters go up and they make fun of it and poke at it, and the mule tries to fight back and all that. And Janie finally says, you know what? Don't do this anymore. It's a mule. And Joe then, out of the kindness of his heart, purchases the mule to protect it. And it becomes like the town pet. Everyone loves the mule. So this is kind of an act of unselfishness of Joe's part for Janie. So it's not like he hates Janie. It's not like he wants her to be unhappy how he treats her. And maybe you can think about why Joe would treat Janie like this. Is there something in his growing up or background or whatever that might make him think this is how a man's supposed to treat a woman? I don't know. But the mule was old in the first place, and the mule dies, and the whole town has like this mock funeral that's kind of joyous and fun. And the whole town is there except Janie. Joe orders Janie to stay in the store. And she hates that. And she doesn't, though. Speaking of the store, there's a missing item, some mishap where there was supposed to be something on the shelves, but it wasn't because someone did order it or something. And of course, Joe blames Janie, and Janie Joe slaps her around. Which, there's a lot of this violence in this, especially if this is about power, right? And this is just another example of it, that Joe has physical and emotional control. Physical control over Janie, maybe not emotional control. And the funny thing is, people feel bad about for Janie, and they all say, and she says too, that she's going to put a good face on the marriage, even though it's not a good thing. So funny here, chapter 7 and 8, 17 years pass in these two chapters. And again, this is all, if you remember, this is the whole story is Janie telling Phoebe after she has returned to the town. So this is just her telling her the story. So over these 17 years with Joe in Eatonville, Florida, this goes along. Joe is aging worse than Janie is, and he will never see a doctor. He's like stubborn like that, and maybe that's a gender thing as well. But the verbal abuse gets worse. But finally, Janie can't handle it anymore. I wouldn't say that can't handle it, but she's done taking it. And so on the porch with all the people sitting around, she finally insults him bad, and results in another slap. And really and slaps are hard. This is like with everything he had. And this is really kind of the end of their marriage. When they go home that night, Joe moves out of the bedroom, and they're never really together much anymore. Like I said, the doctor, Joe's aging. He never calls the doctor. Finally, Janie calls one, but it's too late. I think Joe's kidneys are failing him. And even though Joe orders Janie not to come into the room where he's dying, Janie does, and he tells him things that she probably should have told him years before about who he was and how he can't treat people certain ways. And Joe never agrees and never is like, oh, you're right, I'm sorry. He never does that. And he dies without ever clearing the air. There's a big funeral then for Joe in Eatonville. Everyone comes, obviously. But Janie says she feels no sorrow at the funeral, which, you know, you're supposed to feel bad when it comes to funerals. And she doesn't. She says the first thing she does is goes home and burns the head rags that Joe made her wear as like a indication of freedom. Like, I can do anything I want now. But she doesn't know what she wants to do. She wonders if she should go find her long lost mother Leafy, or she should go live with her nanny again, or whatever. But instead she realizes that she should just stay here for a while and enjoy life, run the store, which she hires people to run, and just enjoy the freedom that she now has. One day there's a big baseball game in a neighboring town where the whole town goes, and this guy named Tea Cake shows up. And Tea Cake was supposed to go to the game too, but went to the wrong place. And so they're sitting and talking, they're enjoying each other. She says, or he says, "You want to play some checkers?" She says, "I don't know how to play." And he laughs at her and says, "Let me teach you." And so they play checkers. Tea Cake comes and visits every once in a while. When he does visits, he sits and helps her. And so now we kind of see a switching of the roles, right? Where it used to be Joe telling Janie what to do all the time. Here comes a man, Tea Cake, who's younger than her, who helps her any way she can. One night they're sitting around and he's combing her hair, and after a while he says, "Look in the mirror." And she does, and she realizes how beautiful she looks. They both are worried, so they don't live in the same place, and so they don't see each other every day, and they both are worried that the other doesn't think of them the same way the other does. But finally they accept that they're going to be a couple. And they do things couples might do. But the next day Tea Cake disappears for days, and Janie's worried, like, oh, he's just another one of those guys. But then he comes back and he says, "I just wanted to save enough money to take you to the Sunday picnic." And so they go, and the town sees this, and the town is upset, the town of Eatonville, because here is Mrs. Mayer, I forget his name already, who is now parading around with this younger man. And Phoebe is assigned the role, because the whole town's talking behind her back, and Phoebe is assigned the role to go talk to her and be like, "You better not do this." And Janie's like, "I don't really care what you think. He's a great guy. I love him. And we're going to do whatever we want to do." And Phoebe is like, "Yeah, you should. Go for it." So they get married in Jacksonville, Florida. They go off to Jacksonville, Florida. And as soon as they get married, Tea Cakes runs off with $200 of Janie's money. And again, Janie's like, "I don't know what to think about this. Maybe he's left me again." And so when he does return, and Janie says, "I was afraid you were going to leave me." And he's like, I don't have any intention of ever leaving you." And he says, "What I did was I went and I paid for a party with my friends, including I charged $2 for the ugly women." And again, this made Janie laugh, but think about what that means in the concept of gender, of who has the power and all that kind of stuff. He says, I did this by myself because I didn't think you'd like my friends. And Janie says, of course I like your friends. That's what I'm here for. There's this, Tea Cakes is a gambler, and he goes and gambles. And when he makes like $300 one time, he tries to leave, and people don't like people who leave once they win big like that. And so he gets stabbed. But Janie's there to help him back and recover. Once he recovers, they decide they're going to go to the Everglades, which is down in southern Florida, and work there. And Tea Cakes is very at home in the Everglades. He knows that everybody there. He knows how the system works. He knows how to get jobs and all that kind of stuff. He tells Janie, "Hey, maybe I should teach you how to shoot guns and things, because that's kind of fun." And really, there's this culture, this migrant culture in southern Florida in the Everglades, right, of people who go there to work, and then when the work is done, they leave. But Janie comments about how hard these people work and how hard they play as well. And she really likes it. She enjoys it there. The people there are accepting. The migrants are accepting of her, even though she's not really one of them. It takes a little time for her to feel at home there, which in other places, if you remember in the story, she's never really felt like she was accepted. that she is here finally. Janie and Tea Cakes realize that they miss each other all day, when he's out working and she's at home. And so she decides that she's going to go to work out in the fields with him. And they love it. They love being together and joking and the people and all that kind of stuff. And out in the field, working hard in the sweat and the dirt and all that kind of stuff, Janie begins to pity the people of Edenville, Florida, that are left back at home, who's never really experienced anything exciting. Let's see. Fight. I think, let me see if I can find my notes here. I hate to tell you the wrong thing. This is interesting. So there's a young migrant female who tries to talk to and flirt with Tea Cakes, and Janie doesn't like it. And so Janie confronts him about it, and instead of her getting hit, she's the one doing the hitting. And so she attacks Tea Cakes, and things calm down, and they realize that they really love each other, and they're kind of devoted to each other. When the work is done in the Everglades, instead of leaving like the other workers do, they stay there. There's not much to do there when there's no work to do. One of the restaurants that they go and eat at a lot is owned by a woman named Mrs. Turner, who is a out-and-out bigot to darker-skinned people. And Tea Cakes is like, we should boycott this place, but they don't, because there's not other places to go to, and this might be symbolic of still of, or emblematic anyways, of, you can't just pick and choose sometimes. Sometimes you're stuck in a world that you have to live in, and it isn't ideal. Mrs. Turner's brother comes, and he's not a bigot, and he tries to make a play for Janie, but she slaps him as well. In the restaurant, there's this big fight, and Tea Cakes tries to stop it, but when he realizes he can't stop it, he joins in, and the restaurant is destroyed basically on the inside. And there's some symbolism here between the emotional damage that Mrs. Turner has caused all the people that have come to a restaurant, and the physical damage that is caused by the fight. And maybe this is payback for all that emotional damage through the years that Mrs. Turner has caused. So storm season is coming to southern Florida, and Janie and Tea Cakes are watching the Seminole Indians leaving because of a hurricane that's coming, but they don't leave. And this is before, if you remember, this is like in the 1930s, when there's no like indication of hurricane coming. Like now we watch TV and we can watch something coming for a week ahead of time. There's none of that. And so the hurricane does come and it destroys everything, and people are running. And there's one incident where they try to get to a bridge and it's full of white people, and so they have to keep moving. And this is where the title of the book comes. Instead of watching the skies or anything, Zora coins this phrase: their eyes were watching God, what God is going to do to them, and the massive power of nature, that no matter what they did on earth, whatever they did and chose to do, really the power of nature is overwhelming. And there's a lake that's being held back, by a levee or whatever, and the lake breaks through, and there's this huge rush of water that sweeps them aside. And Tea Cakes is like, it's very noble. He's like, I want you to live. I want you to live. Grab the tail of this cow that's floating and swimming. And then a dog swims by and is stuck there as well. And the dog reaches out because he's obviously afraid and bites Tea Cakes in the face. But somehow they make it through, and they move to Palm Beach. Tea Cakes goes, and not really goes, is kind of forced to go with other people to help clean up both property and the bodies that are left. And he notices that the white bodies are put into pine coffins, cheap coffins, but still put in coffins, while the black bodies are just put in a pit. And he doesn't like that, so he runs away. He goes back to work. Work has started up again, but the dog bite on his face is infected. He's deranged. He doesn't want to call a doctor either. And this fear of doctors, I don't know what that means. um, but he's deranged as well, and yells at her, and she yells back, and there's a big fight, and they both pull guns on each other, and suddenly they shoot at the same time, and his bullet misses, but her bullet hits him, and he falls forward into her arms and dies. She's tried a quick trial, and found not guilty of doing anything wrong. And again, there's a big funeral, but this time she really feels a loss and really mourns for him. So then we get back to chapter 20, where she's coming back to Eatonville in her overalls, being judged by all the people in the town. But after hearing this story, Phoebe is like, oh man, you've kind of inspired me. Maybe there's more to life than what we do here and sit on the porch and do nothing in Eatonville. And certainly Janie is completely at peace with her memory and of Tea Cake especially, and all that she has done and accomplished and experienced in the world. And she's very content. And that is the end of the book. So again, as we think of these themes of gender and who has power in those relationships and how they changed even, and this concept of friendship and love, and do you get married for love or do you get married for other reasons, and is love important even, and then this concept of judgment and forgiveness, of who's allowed to judge others and why do you do that, and then certainly Janie is a strong, independent character, or at least she ends up being that way. And I'm not sure if you felt bad about her when she would just take it, from when she was married to Joe and not really say anything, but yet she was still independent and feeling those things. So think about this in the context of the 1930s, especially as an African American in the South in the 1930s. And no matter how much you wanted to be independent, could you actually be that way? And if not, then what is holding you back? As a woman, as an African American, all of those things. So there's that book. It's fantastic. We do have it in the library, and so if you feel like you would like to try to read it, she's a great writer. It's a easy book to read. It flows very nice, and there's a lot of dialogue in it, which is easier to read and kind of gets you in the perspective of how the people talked back in the day to each other and all that. And so it's very touching and exciting. So hopefully that helps. And if you're reading any other stories about race and gender, it would be nice to maybe include some of those other books in your analysis as well, and see how they kind of help you understand each other. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.